All right, here we go. Here we go. Well, hello, one and all. I know we'll have some more people joining us. And if you're watching the recording, hello. My name is Kavelin, and I am here to talk about supporting your anxious child. I am Director of Operations here at the Well Counseling and Consulting Group. We have been so honored and privileged to be in partnership with Redeemer Presbyterian Church. I think it's honestly been about 4 years now. And so if they reached out to us kind of in the middle of the pandemic, wanting to provide some additional support to people of color who were looking for mental health treatment. And so they created something called the 4-8 Fund. And so we have been partnered with them in facilitating sessions under the 4-8 Fund for quite some time. And so this year they said, hey, we went and got some more money. We went and found someone else who was interested in helping to kind of join us in this mission. And they have agreed to sponsor several parent workshops. And so this is one of several that we'll be having. So make sure that you're connected to us so you can learn about these things in the future. But we are very excited to have you join us today. Our goals for today are very simple. We're just kind of giving an introduction to the concept of anxiety. I'm going to go off camera here so you can keep your eyes on the screen. But our goal is really to just make sure that we understand the signs and symptoms of anxiety in children. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do to help a child, whether that would be your child or maybe a student that you're working with, that you can support their coping mechanisms and help them kind of reduce and manage anxiety. And then we're going to talk about some of the things that you can do at home to create what we would call a supportive environment that will foster that resilience and lead to better communication about the feelings that your children may have. I do want to give this little disclaimer. We are doing what we're calling psychoeducation. So we're going to talk about mental health things. We're going to talk about some of what we might call the diagnostic criteria, but we are not diagnosing your child. So if your child has not had a diagnosis of anxiety, you might have a really good thinking suspicion that that's the case, but we are not doing any diagnostic work here today. What we will be doing is making sure that you have some strategies, some techniques that you can use. We do recommend that if you have very specific concerns about your child, that you absolutely start with the guidance of a qualified mental health professional. I always recommend starting with your pediatrician, the person that has known your child and maybe watched your child develop for years. They would be a good place to start. We will also give you some additional resources as far as places you can connect with for ongoing treatment if that is the case, okay? So the question for today is, what is anxiety? And it's a topic, it's a word that I think has become more and more common. I don't know, when I talk to my kids sometimes, I don't know 25 years ago or 35 years ago, I don't remember us hearing the word anxiety as much as I do now, right? I don't remember hearing that word. It wasn't a part of our everyday normal conversations. It wasn't something that we talked about on a regular basis. We weren't just chit-chatting over the dinner table and having the word anxiety come up. But very often I hear this word now all the time, but it's not necessarily something that we discuss or define. And I want to be clear before we get into like the full definition that everyone feels anxious from time to time. So having a feeling of anxiety doesn't mean you have a diagnosis of anxiety. So if you have a child who sometimes is worried or gets scared or has a bad dream or something, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a diagnosis of anxiety, because the feeling of anxiety is a normal feeling. That feeling of anxiousness is a normal feeling. It does not necessarily represent a mental health condition. I'm so excited. I haven't been to see the new Inside Out movie yet. But I've heard just amazingly wonderful things about it. And I do plan on taking the kids to see it as soon as our schedule slows down just a little bit. But I hear that they do an amazing job of talking about anxiety in that movie. So I'm looking forward to that as well. But when we talk about having a feeling, a general feeling of like, oh, I was just anxious, I was nervous, I was worried, the question becomes, when do we know that it has kind of gone too far? And we'll talk about some of those things. As I'm going through this information, I want you to be paying attention to what you might be seeing in your child or your children, but I also want you to be paying attention to what you might be seeing in yourself. Because what we do know is that very often children who have a diagnosis of anxiety, oftentimes there is some genetic or familial connection, okay? So how do we know when it has gone too far? So here's a very good description of what we would call generalized anxiety disorder. Now, when it comes to mental health and well-being, from the medical perspective, we use something called the DSM, and we have different versions of the DSM. It continues to get updated. So the DSM describes the different diagnoses that you can have. The same way you would get a diagnosis of, say, diabetes or asthma, you could get a mental health diagnosis based upon certain criteria. So when we're looking at generalized anxiety disorder, that category of diagnosis is generally involved a persistent feeling of anxiety or dread. And this is a really important part, which interferes with daily life. So most of us have a feeling of anxiety that comes or goes. It can be specific to a certain situation or a certain, maybe something that is uncertain. But if it begins to interfere with your daily life, that is where we start to kind of, oh, is there anything else going on? Okay. It's not the same as just like occasionally worrying, or even just specific to certain stressful events. But people who have generalized anxiety disorder will experience the symptoms for months or even years. So it's something that is more long-term. It could be feeling restless, wound up, or on edge. Being easily fatigued. And that one I think sometimes surprises people, but partly it's because your brain is always running. And also sometimes your muscles are really tight and tense. And so that gives you that feeling of fatigue more consistently. Having difficulty concentrating. We see this a lot. I work with a lot of teachers in schools and youth serving organizations, and we see this a lot with kids where they're really bright, but their grades don't show how intelligent they are because they have a hard time eliminating those fears and worries and focusing on the schoolwork. We can see kids who are irritable. Now, this is one that I see a lot and people don't pick up on this, but kids who are kind of moody sometimes can be related to anxiety. Very often we see headaches, muscle aches, or stomach aches, or just generalized unexplained pain that isn't having a medical diagnosis of some other sort. And again, like I said, part of that can be due to the way that our body tenses up or reacts. So having that can be something that causes that pain as well. Difficulty controlling those feelings of worry. So the feeling of worry is so overwhelming, it almost like feels like it's kind of choking you, it's controlling you. It doesn't feel like something that you can kind of manage. And then having trouble with sleep, either having trouble falling asleep because their mind is racing and they can't shut it off, or having trouble staying asleep. So both of those are things that we can definitely see with kids who have that generalized anxiety disorder. Now, that's one kind of big umbrella, but there's some other things that we see very common to kids that are kind of what we might call like variations of this. So panic disorder, where that feeling of anxiety is kind of sporadic and it kind of takes over them. And very often they don't have a clear reason for where the panic is coming from. We see sometimes phobias. So kids who have things that they are terrified of. And this is not just like, oh, I'm afraid of bugs, but like something where they feel like their life is in danger, right? We see separation anxiety. We can see that kind of normally in terms of some development that might happen at certain times of childhood, but we can see this be exacerbated when we know that there is an additional diagnosis. And then that social anxiety piece where kids really struggle with those social connections and kind of getting out and making friendships. But I also like to say anxiety is sneaky, because when we look beneath the surface, very often anxiety can either be in conjunction with these other diagnoses or can even kind of mimic, these other diagnoses can be kind of masked by these diagnoses. So adjustment disorder is one we would say is like, if there was a specific challenge that a child had occurred, a specific event, we would expect that, hey, within a reasonable amount of time, you'll kind of bounce back to your normal functioning level. If they don't bounce back, then that might be something we would call adjustment disorder. Obviously, post-traumatic stress disorder, when there is a very specific thing that causes a child's world to be shaken. Sometimes they can be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and that can go hand in hand with some anxiety. Anxiety and depression often are very, very closely related. They can connect to each other very easily. When we talk about anxiety, we generally are talking about a fear of things that are the unknown or things that are kind of in the future. When we think about depression, we are generally thinking about things that have happened in our past. We have no power in either of those spaces. We don't have power in the past and we don't have power in the future. Our power is in the present. And so when you have a history of anxiety, what can happen is you have this persistent fear of what's going to happen, something bad does happen, or you kind of have a self-fulfilling prophecy, so to speak, and then you will replay that thing that you didn't do well or that didn't go well, and that can kind of lead to those depressive symptoms. Sometimes, however, anxiety is connected to a medical diagnosis as well. I've also seen kids who have been diagnosed with like an oppositional defiant disorder, and they might have some symptoms of anxiety as well. So anxiety can show up as like wanting to be controlling, not being kind of rigid and not open to change. And those are the kind of things that we do see very often in kids who are diagnosed with ODD. And sometimes they can kind of be overlooked that they're actually anxious. So let's do a little bit of an activity time. So, and feel free to share as much or as little as you want. If you're watching this recording, just kind of make a note. Which of these following symptoms are you seeing in your child? I'm going to go through a few symptoms. Now, I want to be really clear. This is not an all-inclusive list of everything that would be considered, in the diagnostic criteria for anxiety or any of those kind of associated disorders. What I think is important is just to kind of recognize, is it time to get some help? Is it time to do something different? Is there something more? If your child has more of these symptoms, or if you recognize that, man, the intensity of this symptom is really pretty high right now, and I see that the intensity of this is maybe requiring some additional support. So just kind of take a note as we go through this list. So would you describe your child as shy? Do they have difficulty meeting new people or difficulty joining new groups? Or I sometimes call these kids that have a, kind of a hidden anxiety, they're kind of fringe kids, right? So they're sometimes with a group, but they're never really a part of the group. So they may be kind of sitting physically along the edge, but other times they're just kind of, they're not the main person in the group. So they have people that they associated with, but they're not really feeling connected to those kids. So maybe they don't have a ton of friends, or they have very few friends. Do they worry excessively about people laughing at them or judging them? Do they avoid things because they don't want to be laughed at or judged? Do they have excessive worries about being lost? Like maybe they've never actually gotten lost or separated from you, but they're really worried about it for some reason. Do they worry excessively about people getting hurt? If you are running late, do they assume something bad happened? Those kind of things. Are they overly concerned about making mistakes? I've seen this in kids. I've seen this get to the place where kids refuse to turn in homework or projects because they don't want to be graded in a negative way, right? Do they ask a lot of questions for reassurance? And this is one of those, as a mom and Mimi of kids with some anxiety, it can be really frustrating because it feels like no matter how many times you answer the question, there is another question to follow, or even the same question being asked repeatedly because they want to confirm that that thing is the same, right? Are they afraid of new or unfamiliar situations, right? Do they kind of avoid, like, is it something where they say like, oh, I'd really like to go there. This is your favorite show or this is your favorite athlete, but they're so afraid of the possibilities of what could happen that they would avoid something that they really like because of the fear, right? That is one of those things that we might be looking at. Do they sometimes have repetitive behaviors? Sometimes we can, that under the heading of the anxiety, we can kind of see some obsessive compulsive behaviors. Do they get upset by changes in their routine? Do they complain about those stomach ache or headaches? Do you notice them having difficulty sleeping, either getting to sleep or staying to sleep, or, maybe having a lot of nightmares, waking up and feeling maybe unsettled because their sleep wasn't restful? Do they have sudden attacks of panic? And I think one of the keys here is sometimes when a kid's like, I just feel like I'm dreading something or something bad is going to happen and I don't know what and I don't know why. They can't name it, they can't describe it, but they just kind of have this feeling that something bad is going to happen, right? That kind of feeling of dread or panic. Do they think repeatedly about previously negative experiences? Did something bad happen in the past, and now they have used that almost as like a lens for everything that is happening in the future? Are they jumpy or irritable? Just seem like they're never quite settled, always kind of tightly wound? Or do they avoid specific activities or situations? So all of these could be, especially like individually, could be just normal things that just happens to be your child's personality and the way that they are. But if you would look at anything on this list and you say like, that has been happening a lot. Or maybe you would say, she talked about camp a lot, and then all of a sudden she didn't want to go to camp, and I wonder why. And now you're starting to kind of think about it. These are just some ways that anxiety can show up in your child's life. Is there anything that you would say on here like, this is really surprising, I didn't realize that was anxiety? Go ahead and drop that in the comments for me. So the next question that parents usually ask me, sometimes teachers ask me too, well, where is this even coming from? Why does everybody seem to have anxiety now? Where is this even coming from? Now, I have some theories about this, and I sometimes will joke and say, like, if I ever go back and get another degree or, do some additional research at the university level, I'm going to try and prove that I think anxiety is one of those things evolutionarily that benefits the human species, right? Because if you think about it, the person who was going to be afraid of the saber-toothed tiger is the one that's probably going to live. The person who's afraid of, jumping and climbing and all these different things, that's the person who's going to survive. So I do think that having some fear and some anxiety actually can protect you and keep you safe. So I think that's actually a good thing. But when we're talking about anxiety that can become overwhelming, where we actually hit a diagnosis, there's a couple of places that we generally would look, right? So there is a genetic component. There has been some identification of that genetic component. Very often, if I see a child with anxiety, someone in the family line has some anxiety as well. What can happen, however, especially when there is, excuse me, some genetics, there is some learned behaviors, right? So mom or dad or grandma or grandpa, they have kind of navigated their anxiety by maybe keeping life very simple or keeping life very rigid or keeping life very routine. And because of that, the child has now said, well, if that's what mom does, and that's what I do. So that can happen. Sometimes stressful or traumatic experiences, especially those that haven't been adequately processed, especially those where we haven't actually had a conversation or kind of supported the development and kind of the processing of that can kind of show up as anxiety. And then sometimes there's just patterns of behavior that condition you to let those anxious feelings explode or kind of take root and overwhelm your overall living experience. But regardless of where it comes from, I think it's incredibly important that we acknowledge that anxiety is common. It is the most common of the mental health conditions, right? About 15 to 20% of the population would potentially have some be able to be diagnosed with anxiety. It is treatable. There is absolutely support and solutions, and it's no one's fault, right? And I think that's really important that we make sure kids understand there's nothing wrong with you and it's no one's fault. Okay. A lot of kids who have a tendency to have anxiety, who kind of skew to those anxious feelings and even the diagnosis of anxiety, they spend a lot of time being afraid of getting in trouble, being afraid of disappointing people, being afraid of letting people down. that can, over time, as they grow and mature, they can, develop coping skills and work around that. But I have also seen people who use that to become a people pleaser or to become, an overachiever and things of that nature. So one of the things as we're going through kind of some of the ways that you can create that supportive environment, you just want to make sure that you are clarifying on a consistent basis that it's no one's fault, that this is just something that our brains can do. There are some benefits to it because it keeps us safe, but we also want to make sure that we are navigating and managing it as well. So some of the ways that we can just overall help, and I'm honest with you, the truth is these things are good whether your child has anxiety or not. These are just great things to do just because they benefit children in general. So increasing your use of emotional language. I'm going to have a slide in just a second that will give you a lot of words that you may or may not have heard or use on a regular basis, but we want to get into the habit of using the correct term for how we feel. It's one of the reasons why, counselors like myself are so thrilled about the movie Inside Out, is because every time we can increase someone's emotional language, we increase their potential for emotional intelligence. It increases their ability to advocate for themselves, utilize coping skills, communicate effectively. All of those things are just good things, right? So you want to make sure that you're giving your child the tools to communicate how they feel and the space to do so, right? When you are working with your child, you want to make sure that you're giving very consistent and specific praise. When they're trying something that's hard, and even if it's not going as well, you want to provide that reassurance and support for the effort that they're putting in, the attempt that they're making, the progress that they're making. You want to be open and honest about the schedule, the routines, and the expectations. So if things do need to change, I wouldn't say that you need to pretend, right? I wouldn't say that you have to become a slave to your child's anxiety, but if things need to change, if there's going to be a change in the routine, just be openly communicative about that. Sometimes we can kind of practice with kids, like, what would you like us to try? Or, I think our schedule might get a little off, so we won't have time to have dinner at home. Do you want to look at the menu on Wendy's website to decide what you want to eat before we get there? That kind of thing, just to kind of provide that coming attraction so they have less unknowns and more ability to kind of decide what they want to do with the knowns. The key one that you cannot underestimate the value of is modeling and allowing for the use of coping skills. So you want to make sure that your child has a variety of coping skills that they know how to use, and you want to make sure that you give them the space and opportunity to use it, okay? Part of that is knowing what is going to be a trigger. So, for example, if you know that going into uncertain situations with new people is a trigger for your child, you're going to want to make sure that you're preparing them for that. I have a rising senior this year, so we are doing all the college tours and all the college visits. And there was one particular university that she was interested in seeing. And I said, well, they've got a camp this summer. I think the camp was maybe 4 or 5 days. I said, I think you should do it. And she's like, go away to be with strangers for 5 days? Are you kidding me? And I said, well, I think it would be beneficial for you because, normally when we go to college, it's just a couple hours. And so you're going to get a peak at the university, but you're not going to get the full experience. And she's like, I cannot go that many days. I just cannot. And I said, okay. So then she tried a smaller camp that was only a couple days. And then she texted me and she says, oh, I totally could have done the other camp. And I said, I know you could, but she knew that was a trigger for her. And it was important to me to give her an opportunity to experience it. But we kind of gave her a step in the right direction. So she didn't go all the way to the 5-day, but she went to the 2-day, right? So it's important. And that kind of brings us to don't protect your children from that anxiety, right? A lot of times parents, that's one of the key things that they want to do is we want our kids to be happy and safe. We want them to not have struggles or pain. We sometimes feel their pain so deeply and intentionally that we want to avoid it for them and for us, right? But one of the key things that you can do is let them experience hard things. Let them try things. Let them maybe fail, flounder a little bit, and then talk about what happened and what worked and what didn't. Those are the kind of things that will allow your child to really blossom and develop some great coping skills that will ultimately help them in the future. So as we name and normalize the feelings and potential diagnosis of anxiety, it can really reduce the isolation that your child may feel, which can lead to, what we've seen sometimes can lead to that depression where if I feel like I'm not safe and I'm always in my head, then I just feel like, well, what's the point? What's the point of going on? That's how we can get into that slippery slope of the anxiety and depression connection. So this is that slide I said I was going to share with you. If you look at this slide, you'll see that there is just a huge variety of emotions. And I would encourage you to just kind of consider how many of these words are you using on a daily, a weekly, or a monthly basis, right? Are we just saying angry? Are we just saying mad? Are we actually maybe jealous or devastated or embarrassed, right? So clarifying the exact emotion that they're feeling and using those emotional words as often as possible. That full spectrum of emotion is actually a really beneficial tool for kids who have anxiety. So I want you to get into the habit of using that full variety of emotions for kids so that they don't have to feel overwhelmed by it. Sometimes, and there is a phenomenon where just being able to actually name the exact emotion actually can help relieve a little bit of the discomfort. So like, it's kind of like if you're thinking like, oh, I've got a word on the tip of my tongue and you just can't quite remember that word, that relief that you feel when you remember the word, that is the same kind of feeling that can happen for kids who have a feeling that they can't name. So you helping them to name it, that's actually a really good thing. In some homes, I have seen parents where they keep the different emotional language kind of, on a poster. Obviously in classrooms, I've seen that as well. It wouldn't be uncommon now that we've got things like Inside Out and movies like that to keep those kind of, dolls or posters around. You just want to make sure that you are doing everything in your power to make sure that you're talking about the full spectrum of emotion, because sometimes kids they feel like they only have the one, and they usually have others, right? And so that if we can kind of describe that, that can be really a benefit for them as well. Okay, so we're going to go into a little bit of an activity here because as we're talking about emotional language, I think it's really important that we acknowledge that anxiety is not bad. It is not a bad feeling. It is not a bad emotion. It is not anything that we need to avoid. From a biological standpoint, the feeling of anxiety is a benefit. Our goal is never to eliminate the feelings of anxiety in their entirety. Our goal would be to reduce the symptoms of anxiety or those feelings of anxiety so that it doesn't interfere with our life. But if we spend all of our time kind of making anxiety the enemy, then we're, basically teaching our kids that they should not welcome or respect or appreciate that part of them that is actually a benefit, okay? So I want you to get into the habit of using more neutral language. So here's how we would kind of do this. So instead of saying he's so shy, which sometimes people would say that's a neutral thing, but we generally have a negative connotation to the word shy. We don't say shy as a good thing, right? So just say like, it takes a little bit more time to warm up to new things, right? Shift from saying, oh, she just worries too much to she's very thoughtful, right? That's not a bad thing. A person who's thorough and pays attention to details is not a bad thing. Instead of saying he has tantrums, maybe we say he has strong emotions. Okay. Instead of saying he's scared of everything, we would say, oh, he's cautious, right? Instead of saying she's being so difficult, you say she's really expressing her feelings. She's expressing her needs, right? Instead of saying he's overreacting, we want to shift to saying like, he just needs a little bit more time to process. He's having a really strong reaction, right? Instead of saying, oh, she's so clingy, just say she likes to be connected, okay? Instead of saying he's a perfectionist, we say, well, he has high standards. So we are not lying when we shift to this more neutral language, but we are reducing some of that stigma, right? We're reducing some of that pressure, some of that negative connotation, because we want to normalize that these feelings are here, that some of these personality traits or behaviors are here. And we can decide once we shift from, oh, this is a bad thing that has to stop, we can shift into like, okay, well, how do we just make this maybe less? How do we balance this with some other behaviors or some other thoughts or some other feelings? Okay. So if there's anything you see on this list that you're doing too much of, okay, or you say like, oh, I definitely do that a lot, don't feel bad. That is a really common thing. These are things that I've heard, that I have said, that I have heard by many a parent and many a teacher in many different situations. We just want to work on shifting this. And part of this is really beneficial for kids because one of the most common treatments for anxiety, if they were to need kind of a mental health intervention, is cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's really where we start to focus on the connection between the thoughts, the feelings, and the behaviors. And it's, working on reframing those things and then choosing, the behaviors that we would like to be associated with. Those things are things that we definitely want to work on. And this kind of sets them up for that. Now, how do you think anxiety affects your ability to focus or concentrate on tasks? Do you think it affects you? Do you think it affects your children? Because I think for a lot of us, that is one of the common reasons why we begin to seek out treatment, because it prevents us from getting things done, and we kind of get frustrated with that. So and that's a question that as I'm working with children, that like if I was working with a child, that would be a question I might ask. Do you think this is affecting your ability to focus? Do you think this is affecting your ability to connect with your friends? As you kind of have these questions where you get some feedback, that will help you determine what is your next right step. So some other specific solutions. So believe it or not, physical touch can be really great for anxiety. Obviously, we always want to give children control and autonomy over their body. But, I might say like, hey, you know what? You might just need a little pressure. Give yourself a hug real quick. Give yourself a hug, right? We sometimes will do something called a butterfly hug, which is using a little bit of a EMDR technique, but that can sometimes help to settle that nervous system that is overwhelmed or kind of overrun. I definitely believe in aromatherapy. So lotions that have maybe like lavender, and I would go with more the natural things, not the artificial smells, but things that actually have some essential oils in them. Just rubbing your hands together can actually reduce your stress. So just having a little bit of maybe lavender scented essential oil lotion that you could just, when they're feeling a little bit stressed, that's just a coping strategy that actually can decrease their anxiety levels. If they're home, you could have them take a hot shower or soak their feet. Again, just a way to kind of reset that nervous system. I am a big fan of yoga, stretching, Pilates, anything that moves the body, because it does help to kind of discharge some of that anxious energy. Walking and talking is another good one. A lot of times kids the pressure of just sitting still and having a conversation can be hard for them. My kids, even some of my older kids, their favorite thing to do was to have a complete conversation while we were in the car. And I used to think like, why every time I get in the car, do they want to have a complete conversation? I just want to drive. I want to listen to my music. But there was just enough of a distraction. There was just enough of like not that pressure of that direct eye contact. And so sometimes just that would give them the space and opportunity to open up. And then again, because sometimes with anxiety, we can kind of have a tendency to hold on to muscle tension, progressive muscle relaxation can be helpful as well. And these are all things that I would encourage you to just kind of try with your child. So I might say like, hey, you know what? I just got this new thing. I just saw this great video on YouTube. Would you want to try it with me? And you kind of do it with them. And then you talk about how you feel afterwards. One of the things that I think is really important for parents to understand, there is absolutely a time where therapy or mental health treatment for your child's anxiety is appropriate. But the research is pretty clear on this. You implementing things at home is actually at least as beneficial, if not and more beneficial in some instances than actually them having one-on-one treatment. And here's the reason why. If they're lucky, they're going to go to therapy 1 hour a week, or maybe 1 hour every other week. And they've got another 167 hours or so each week that they're outside of that therapy room. Okay. Now they're not with you all of those hours either. And some of those hours you're both sleeping. But there's chances are there's probably 100 different ways over the course of a week where you can inject a little bit of a coping skill, inject a strategy, process an event or that would benefit them so that can actually reduce their anxiety. It happens all the time, okay? So don't think that you just have to have, direct mental health therapy, that's the only way for your child to benefit. There's actually a lot more benefit to you kind of implementing some strategies at home. In terms of our breathing exercises, we are as human beings, we are the only creature that has the ability to control our breath in this way. And it is a wonderful way to kind of remind your nervous system that you're safe, okay? So you want to make sure that you're using things like bubbles, pinwheels, sometimes like a breathing script. I'm a big fan of breath work. You can find some great videos on YouTube. But you want to just kind of use your breath to remind your brain that you're safe. Okay. And then when we come to talking about cognitive behavioral exercises, these are the ones that we would generally think of more commonly with, working with the therapist, but sometimes they'll give you some homework. There's also some solutions you can get in certain books and things like that. You want to reduce the overestimation of danger. So we don't want them to lose their perception of danger. That's not the goal. We don't want them running out there being unsafe. We just want to, kids with anxiety have a tendency to overestimate the danger of a situation. So we want to reduce their overestimation. So that's just a little bit more balanced, a little more accurate, okay? But then we want to increase the confidence that they have in their personal ability. The only way to truly increase confidence is to actually do things, right? They have to take action, and then you want to reflect on what they've done. Just like I said about my daughter going off to the camp, as she was there and she was experiencing it and she felt like, man, I really could do this. Now her confidence for the next one is more, right? So you want to focus on things that help them to increase the confidence. When I'm working with a child who is maybe I want to reduce that overestimation of danger, I just take any extreme language that they might have, and I try to look for the actual fact. So there's fact and there's feeling. And so very often they're going to use their feelings and sometimes their TikTok research or their social media research to develop a belief system about something. And so what you want to do is like, let's go to the actual fact, right? The fact is that it's really only this amount of time. The fact is you'll have this many opportunities to kind of take a break. The fact is you can use this coping skill, right? You want to reduce that overestimation of danger. And then you also want to talk about the ways that they might have experienced certain things in the past, or you were really good at this thing, or you really enjoyed that thing. So you increase their confidence. Those are really specific solutions that can benefit your kids. Okay, does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? Any questions? And you're welcome to use the chat or unmute if you would like. All right, I don't see any questions coming in. So I'd love for you, if you are watching this on the recording, or if you're, not watching this on your phone, I'd love for you to just scan this QR code and give us a little bit of feedback for today. As I mentioned, this is something that is being sponsored by Redeemer Presbyterian Church. They have grant funders that they are responsible to. So all of the feedback that you give us, we can pass along to them, which keeps all of these resources free for our community. And we love that. As we've wrapped up for today, you would say like, hey, I do think that I want to have some additional support. First and foremost, for you as an adult, you as the caregiver, you as the parent, we at the Well Counseling Group would love to be a support for you. So we do accept several insurance companies. Currently, I think United Healthcare, Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, IU Health Plans. We obviously have that Redeemer Scholarship, that 4A fund. We generally can get people in within about 7 days, sometimes sooner than that. But we also have additional resources on our website. We've got blogs, we've got books, we've got things of that nature. Now, if you're saying, you know what, I'm going to try this stuff, but I'm really concerned about my child, and I think I want them to have some additional resources. When I send out the recording for today, there'll be a few things that I will include in that. And if you're watching this on the recording, there will be a additional resource guide that will be included with that. That will include some links to these, but these are just some places that we have had success with referring children to. We don't currently see children under the age of 18 at the Well, but we do have our community partners that work well with us. That Indianapolis Counseling and Mentoring, they also accept the Redeemer 4-H fund, so that is great. Hope Haven, One Sensible Solution, and Children's Resource Group are all organizations in the Indiana, kind of Marion County, Hendricks County, Boone County area that I know we've had really great success with referring to and gotten good feedback that they take good care of their clients. And so we wanted to pass those along to you if you would decide that now will be a good time for your child to get some additional support. Like I said, it's not always necessary, even when you think there is a diagnosis, it's not always necessary, but it can be a benefit. Because if like, let's say one of their primary areas of difficulty is at school, they do have access because of, if they do have a diagnosis, they would possibly get some access to some additional supports at the school level. So it can definitely benefit them. So if you are seeing more of those signs or symptoms, or they're increasing in frequency or intensity, please do reach out to one of these providers. They are available to help. And remember, help is available. I want to thank you for joining me for a little while on this Thursday afternoon. I hope this has been beneficial for you. Like I said, keep your eyes and ears open. We will have additional resources through this partnership with Redeemer. We also have some things coming up for Minority Mental Health Awareness Month in July. So we will have some additional opportunities for trainings and workshops and events to help you live your best life. Thank you so much for your time, and I will see you all again soon.